very good evening and welcome to The Bottom Line, a wrap of some of your top business news stories of the day. My name is Nzinga and we begin as usual with your number of the day. Today, that number is $100 billion. That, according to the UN Economic Commission for Africa, is how much the continent will need in its fight against the coronavirus. Now, the World Bank suggests that in a worst-case scenario, between 110 million and 720 million people could become infected with COVID-19. So as we know, the health of citizens is closely linked with the economies and their performance in the respective countries they live in. In an article for Applied Economics and Finance, Justice Som, Salsa Pasasi and Martin Carbone said, and I quote, 9.4-year increase in life expectancy leads to a 1% increase in real GDP per capita. So we can surmise then that what happens when there's a predicted loss of life at such a large scale and what's set to happen to the African economy as we go through this coronavirus is very, very dire. So let's get more on the effects of the coronavirus on the economy. I'm joined via Skype by the Minister of Trade and Industry, Ibrahim Patel. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this evening. Talk to us about the effect that the coronavirus has so far had on trade and industry in South Africa and whether we are able to accurately quantify that yet.
Good evening, both to the viewers and to you, Zinga. Let me start with the impact of the virus on South Africa's industry. It's enormous. The pandemic has had a serious and very severe impact on many South African business. It's reduced demand for exports. It's hammered the domestic industry with reduced demand. And of course, we've had to deal with the effects of the lockdown. And increasingly now, workers who are positive, COVID positive in the workplace, and unable to work for that period. We've had a range of estimates of the impact. They all really indicate how serious the problem is. And in fact, your number of the day, the $100 billion as the cost of the pandemic on the African continent, gives an indication of the size and the impact.
Mm-hmm. We also know that one of the impacts that's been had from the coronavirus is the delay of the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. What effect has that had on South Africa in particular?
Well, let me start with indicating the importance of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Africa as a continent has more than 1 billion people. Our economy is sustained by 60 million South Africans. And so a Continental Free Trade Area is really about creating the scale and the depth for South African manufacturers and service providers to be able to play in a bigger market, creating more jobs in South Africa and growing our GDP. And in fact, Nzinga, the experience of countries across the world is that size of market matters enormously. We've had to delay the switch-on date of the Continental Free Trade Area, which was the 1st of July, and we're shifting it to the 1st of January next year. And that is because much of the technical, legal, and institutional work to get the free trade area moving, to implement it effectively, had to be delayed because our officials couldn't travel to tie up these arrangements. And of course, there's been severe disruption to transport and logistics systems in this period. But we think that this is the big story for the next decade, the source of enormous growth. And if you look at something like the wearing of face masks or the use of hand sanitizer, these products need to be produced locally, but we need a large market in future to be able to sustain the new production that's required to operate in the post-COVID world. It's, by the way, not just health products. It's also basic foods and other basic goods. Because what happened during this period is global supply chains became disrupted. And many listeners and viewers may not know this, but in fact, some of our auto plants closed their operations even before the president announced a lockdown because they couldn't get parts and equipment from other parts of the world. So the Continental Free Trade Area gives us an opportunity for scale to get the kind of investment we need. So we remain committed to it.
Okay, Minister, let's come to a very specific industry in South Africa. The metals industry is said to be worth around 15 billion rand. One of the ways you're trying to mitigate the challenges that you've spoken about is an investigation into that industry. Tell us more.
The metal industry, particularly the foundries and the steel mini mills, have had their supply of scrap metal severely curtailed in this period. And there are a number of reasons for this. First, industry, when we had the lockdown period, of course, there was less scrap metal that was generated. And scrap metal, by the way, is a big feedstock. It's an input into these smaller steel mills and foundries that provide basic components and goods that is used in infrastructure and in other industries. So if South Africa loses its foundry industry, that's the base of any country's industrialization, then our ability to expand manufacturing would be severely compromised. Here's a significant number, Nzinga, that you may want to ponder. Africa has 17% of the world's population, but it only produces 1% of the world's steel. And if we have this, and steel industry is concentrated very significantly in South Africa, we can't afford to lose our steel industry. And so to protect that industry, to support that industry, I have requested the public body, it's called ITAC, to do an urgent investigation to see how the industry can get a greater supply of scrap metal as a basic feedstock to keep our factories going and to create employment for South African workers.
So one of the other things that you want to do is blocking the exports of ferrous and non-ferrous metals and scrap. Do you have an indication of how long that will last for?
I'd like it to be for a short period, something of the order of 2 months, to give ITAC, that's our regulatory body, the chance to complete the investigation and give some recommendations to me of how we can ensure that the industry has the supply of scrap. If we can resolve that issue, if we can get scrap in sufficient quantities and competitive prices for local industry, then we'd want to lift the temporary restriction on the export of scrap metal. In the longer term, we are looking at an export tax on scrap metal. Many countries in this period have actually prohibited scrap metal exports because every country is trying to get its manufacturing base back to work. In our case, we're looking at an infrastructure-led economic recovery plan, and that infrastructure requires the products that come from foundries and steel mini mills. So it's an essential issue that we need to address, and I've had to use some short-term measures to ensure that there is the supply of basic inputs for the steel industry.
Minister, I know you've spoken about consulting with that body, but one of the criticisms about how government has handled the lockdown is that there isn't wide enough consultation with various stakeholders, and that leads to sometimes having to go back to regulations and amending them once there's an uproar or once there's a court challenge and the like. How widely have you consulted in this instance? And more broadly, when you look at the actions leading up until this point, are there changes that you think you need to make as government before deciding on how certain things are going to work?
No, I think it's vital that we get the input from industry, because they know the trading conditions that they face on a day-to-day basis. And so we've not initiated this on our own as government. It's at the request of a number of companies, firms, productive operations in the economy that have written to us and contacted us with the challenges that they face. Of course, in the next 2 months, we have more opportunity to consult even more widely, to talk to many more players, but we had to immediately put some measures into place to stop the hemorrhaging of local industry. I intend to deepen the consultation in the period ahead, because we want to hear all views. At the end of the 2-month period, before I make a decision that would have wider implications and would be for a longer period of time, I will take into account all the views of different sectors of industry. And we do this because we have found that when we consult widely, we get much deeper and better feedback. Of course, it's industry we have to consult with, but also organized labor and downstream users. So it's a range of different players that would need to be heard. And in this period, we've had to balance the need to move swiftly with providing industry an opportunity to give us feedback. So this initiative, or this set of regulations that I've issued today, are a result of a call by industry, by the domestic players. And I will use this now to initiate a period of even deeper and more extensive consultation.
Minister Brian Patel, Minister of Department of Trade and Industry, joining us via Skype there. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this evening. So consumers have been taking up relief measures offered by credit providers since the lockdown. This is according to the National Credit Regulator. The NCR says wage cuts, retrenchments and income losses will negatively impact the ability of consumers to keep up with debt repayments. So according to the latest research by TransUnion, the number of consumers who have lost their jobs has increased sharply since the beginning of April. It says its ongoing research to better understand the financial impact of COVID-19 on consumers shows that 82% of households reported that their income was being negatively impacted by the pandemic. The NCR, meanwhile, says with low interest rates and lowering the cost of debt, consumers continue to take on more debt. The Reserve Bank has lowered the repo rate by 2.75 basis points, providing relief to indebted consumers in light of the economic crisis brought by the coronavirus pandemic.
There's a decrease in interest rates. We see some consumers actually taking on more debt as opposed to paying their existing debts. So that's what happens, unfortunately. Consumers tend to take on more debts and like to pay what they currently owe. So with regards to the current interest rate decreases, we will see the impact in the next coming months, maybe 4 to 5 months coming.
Let's take a look at the markets at the close of the JSE today. The rand trading at 17 rand and 5 cents to the dollar. When we look at commodities, a barrel of Brent crude oil trading at $42.55. Let's take a look at the rest of the indicators. It's good night from me, Criselda and Simon, standing by to take you through the rest of prime time.